Hello and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. With over 15,000 downloads since launch, we are excited to bring you Season 4 featuring in-depth content on business, global affairs and news across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. We've had some extraordinary guests on our channel, including W Series driver Abby Eaton.
I've got thoughts of the future now. I'd love to try and kind of mentor some of the younger drivers,
Renowned UK international education champion, Professor Sir Steve Smith.
Over about a 4-year period, we kept increasing the resources going into mental health provision.
Chief Executive and Director of the London Design Museum, Tim Marlowe.
The way we design is actually thinking about the needs of everyone.
And CEO of the Industry Cluster Group at JTC, Alvin Tan.
If you look at TDD, we are creating an ecosystem of companies, government agencies and industry associations in the digital space.
Thank you, as always, for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy this podcast.
So just a reminder for those of you who Gobeyond is, they're a consulting firm. So part of the Web Help group, they work on broadening and deepening customer service to help break down organizational silos, to help brands create more of an omni-channel experience. So their services focus on consulting, innovation, management technology, as well as organizational excellence. And their clients are across a range of different sectors. So hopefully those of you listening in today will find this conversation helpful. And if you do want to learn more, obviously reach out to the Gobeyond Partners and move that conversation forwards. Fab. So without further ado, let's get into our next round of questions, because I think the last conversation that we had was really exciting there. So Richard, I think I'll start with you on this one, if that's okay. So what are some behavioural science techniques that brands can apply to create a more personalised and engaging customer experience, particularly when it comes to the customer service infrastructure that they have set up, that their customers will be using to engage with that brand?
Well, yeah, so I guess, one of the things about behavioural science is, and I mentioned this in the last episode, is we've learned a lot in a very short space of time about how to influence human behaviour and what influences human behaviour. And in fact, in behavioural science research, there's been over 200 different behavioural biases or heuristics, mental rules of thumb that we know exist out there in the world that help guide our decision making. So knowing which ones apply in a particular context can be quite challenging and requires a level of knowledge and expertise. So, there are many different ways to address these kind of problems. But there is a kind of overarching principle. And I would say, when you look at the most successful brands in the 21st century, particularly in the digital world, what you might call the FANGs, the likes of Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, etc. What's dominated there and driven their success has been this ability to apply understanding of behaviour at scale and to test and learn rapidly in applying that. And so, and that's what's driven the success of their businesses, I would say, more than their technological innovation. I'm sadly old enough to remember when Google launched in 1998. And if you recall, at that point when Google launched, there were multiple different search engines around that you could use, the likes of Yahoo, AltaVista, Ask Jeeves. But what led to Google's dominance in the sector was primarily that they made things easy. So, and what I mean by that, Richard Chataway is a Nobel Prize-winning behavioural economist who co-wrote the book Nudge. When he was asked to summarise the kind of principles of Nudge in 3 words, he says, make it easy. And that doesn't just mean, making things physically easier for people. It means making it mentally or cognitively easier for people to use as well. And that is, if you look at a brand like Google, the way they've used behavioural science techniques is to consistently make the user experience and the user interface as cognitively easy for people to use as possible. So one classic example of this is, if you think back to those days in 1998, when you used the other search engines, you had to search by category. The interface was really crowded and cluttered with different buttons and ads and all those kind of things, whereas Google launched with a very simple, single bar. You didn't have to enter your search query as a question like you did with Ask Jeeves, if you remember that. You have to say, what is the capital of Malaysia, rather than, capital of Malaysia, as you can do with Google. And that very simple interface and making it cognitively easy for people to use drove their market dominance. And even down to using some really counterintuitive things informed by behavioural science, such as the "I'm feeling lucky" button that Google has, that still has on the page. The data shows that virtually no one uses that. It's as close to 0% as it possibly could be. And in fact, when people do use the "I'm feeling lucky" button for their search on Google, it actually costs Google money because you go directly through to the search results rather than seeing the paid listings that advertisers have paid for. Yet that button, 25 years on, that button is still on the Google page, and it's still part of the interface. And the reason for that is because it gives people confidence in the results that you give. Because what it's saying, the "I'm feeling lucky" button, is Google are saying, our search results are so good, you could go through the top search result, you'll probably find what you want. But just in case, here's the Google search so you can see all the listings, and people still use that. And that's a behavioural concept we call self-efficacy. If you give people confidence in the service that you're providing, they value it more, they're more likely to use it. So that's a really tangible example, I think, of how behavioural science techniques have driven the growth of those kind of businesses as part of the infrastructure that they provide, and part of the user interface. And obviously one of the things that Google has built its success around has been consistently testing and learning, using user data to understand some of these behavioural effects. So, I guess that's one of my, if you like, my mantras around this, is that, to be continually testing and learning, to be using real user data where possible, behavioural data, to inform the way that we build great customer experiences and customer service. And that's one of the techniques is just about making things as easy as possible from a user perspective, not just physically easier to use, but mentally easier as well.
Great. Yeah, using Google, I think, is a very relatable example that everyone can understand this. So that was very clear. And Ask Jeeves is such a blast from the past there. The next question I'm going to direct towards Dave, if that's okay. So how can behavioural science be used to foster greater brand advocacy in relation to customer service infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks. It is really interesting because we often talk about loyalty and we talk about advocacy, and they're associated, they're linked, but they're not the same thing behaviourally. So advocacy is the likelihood that you will recommend a brand or a company to someone else. And in the CX world, that's often measured by a score that we call Net Promoter Score or NPS. And the philosophy behind that question is, would you recommend this brand? And it's usually expressed as to friends, colleagues, family. And the reason that those references are used is because there is a degree of social risk. If you recommended a poor company to a colleague, you're going to see that colleague again. You wouldn't recommend a poor company to a family member or a friend because it might jeopardize that relationship with those people. So advocacy is very much associated with a kind of personal reputation in a way. I am recommending this company to other people. That's a much more active state to be in. Whereas loyalty can often be quite passive. If we regard loyalty as the likelihood that I'm going to continue to purchase products or services from a company, I'm going to buy again, then we get into the area that Richard was just describing, which is associated with the idea of effort. So how much effort is it not to buy from a company again, as much as how much effort is it to buy from the company again? If we think about financial services historically, a large part of the financial services kind of retail business model was built upon inertia. The effort it takes to change a bank account in the past was significant. And therefore, you would be loyal in the terms of continuing to use those financial services in the sense of, well, actually, I can't be bothered to change my bank account because all of my payments are linked to it, and that's a lot of hassle. Now, interestingly, through the digital world, many of those barriers, much of that effort of changing companies has been reduced or removed. So therefore, we can't rely on inertia as a mechanism for loyalty. We have to be, as brands, more conscious and active about securing loyalty. But interestingly, when you step over and look at it from the customer's point of view, they may not be conscious of some of those behavioural science interventions that we're putting in front of them to retain their loyalty, because we're taking away the friction. We're making things easier to understand, making it easier for people to make the right choices and get to the right outcome. And actually, that's reflecting what Richard was talking about, within much of the nature of how humans make decisions. It's not as rational and conscious as we would like to think. So when we look at loyalty in terms of behavioural science, it quite often isn't about the wow moments. It isn't about the delighting the customer as much as removing friction, making things really simple, easy, clear, and able to understand. Advocacy then is something else. So advocacy, if you want to recommend a company, you're not unlikely to say, well, they're okay. Yeah, they're all right. I deal with them. It's never a problem. I quite like them. You want to find those things where you say, I absolutely love them. Their products are brilliant. I had a problem, and when I dealt with them, the way they fixed it and sorted it out was amazing. So it's interesting when we look at these two concepts of loyalty and advocacy. And I think certainly from a behavioral science point of view, removing friction to secure loyalty can create significant economic value for a client or for a brand.
Yeah, and I know consumers today, we're so used to engaging with the Apples of the world and other forward-looking and tech companies. So we expect that experience across every brand, right? We don't differentiate by industry. So it's hugely important. Okay, so question for both of you. Can you each share examples of brands that have successfully applied behavioural science principles to enhance their customer experience? And what were the key strategies that they used?
So I think if I think about a retail client that we work with, so this was a client that had both e-commerce and physical stores. And like many organizations, they wanted to respond to the shift to digital, but also were really conscious of the value that the brand experience delivered in a retail store. That they're in the market of selling leisure goods, so DIY, camping, bikes, etc. And for them, actually, the visit to the store was, a really important touch point for the brand. But also, they were aware that, they didn't have stores in every location, in every city, and therefore the digital experience was really key. And what was happening was that people were going to the store for, if you like, post-sale support. I bought a product, even if I bought it online, and then I needed to phone the local store, visit the local store to get the staff in there to fix that problem or answer my query. And actually economically for that client, if they could get people to answer those questions online, where that was possible, or if they did need human support, to direct that through a digital channel into a contact center. That was a lot more efficient and cost effective. So we did a lot of work with them, looking at the design of how they guided people to where best to find answers. And this looked at all communication. So when people had order confirmation emails, and where they had even receipts and purchases, how they were instructed on where to go if they had a question. And that was about taking less focus on phone numbers or visiting stores, and really starting to guide people using some of the nudge techniques that Richard's team are so strong at, in terms of guiding people, and with nudges that typically say customers find they get a quicker answer in a digital channel, or we've got a knowledge and self-service capability that will enable you to deal with those queries. So we did a number of things, such as looking at all their comms. We redesigned their contact us and knowledge pages on their website to make it a lot easier for people to relate the knowledge to the particular question they might have. And we did a lot of work about linking that to a journey. So are you wanting to buy a product? Have you already bought a product? Are you waiting for your delivery? And using those to just make it easier for people to categorize their question and get to answer. And then also in Google search, if you search for the company, typically it would give you the phone number for the local branch as part of the Google business response. And actually we started to deprioritize the phone number and present a chat into a Google search result. So somebody could actually chat directly with a digital support agent to answer a question, rather than trying to get through to an individual store where the staff may be involved in serving customers in the shop and not actually have the time to answer a phone call, for instance. So I think that was one where we combined thinking around the digital channels with, I guess, behavioural science within the communication that guided and steered people to where they would get a quicker and probably easier answer to a query that they had. And I'm sure, Richard, you'll have lots of other examples as well.
Yeah, I think there's I would like to share, I guess, a couple of examples, I guess, from the wider world, and some of those kind of dominant 21st century businesses, to illustrate a couple of those principles, and then I can talk to a couple of our specific experiences, particularly in the banking and financial services sector. So going back to your question earlier about personalization, Nicki, I think one really interesting example, which is something that's been adopted in a widespread way across multiple different e-commerce sites, and is the concept of the recommendation engine. So what that means is that there's a concept in behavioural science which is called the paradox of choice, which is that if we are given too many options to choose from, and we have too many things to choose from, and in most fields now we have an abundance of choice in terms of providers and services that we can use, we find that overwhelming as people often, and we face choice paralysis. So we don't make a decision because we have too many options and we can't possibly decide what the best one is. So anything that facilitates that and allows us to narrow down our options and make an easy choice is something that we really value. And a great example of this is Netflix, and this is an approach that's been copied by all of the kind of online streaming services now. There's so many different things, when you sit down to watch Netflix, there are many, many, many different options available to you in terms of what movies and TV shows you could watch. So Netflix has to make that choice easier for us and make it easier for us to select something we will watch. And so it has a recommendation engine, which basically provides you with a percentage match of a particular show and recommends things to you based on how well it matches what you think you would like to watch, which is a personalized experience. Those recommendations are unique to you as a user. But what's interesting about that is, one, is that it's an approach that they replicated from dating websites. The kind of percentage match thing is something that dating websites use extensively. But also is that as a user, we have no idea how it's recommending stuff to us, what the algorithm is that's powering that, and why it recommends certain shows. But because it helps us with deciding what to watch, it's something that's hugely powerful and drives a huge amount of loyalty to that particular product. Amazon Prime is another great example. There's a thing called the power of free in behavioural science. Things that we feel are free, we value significantly more than we should, because we feel we're getting something for nothing, and it generates a sense of reciprocity towards the brands that deliver free products for us. So, and what was interesting with Amazon Prime in particular is that when Amazon did the analysis around the impact of Amazon Prime, they did the econometric analysis. It predicted that it would be hugely unprofitable for them as a business. It was going to cost them millions and millions of dollars every year. But they decided to run a test on it anyway, to look at actual user data. So in the US, they ran a controlled test where they offered Amazon Prime. So this is unlimited free delivery for a monthly subscription. They decided to see what impact that had on user behavior. And what they found was that it was a huge driver of loyalty to the product. So those people who had Amazon Prime were spending nearly twice as much every month on Amazon products than people who didn't have Amazon Prime. And they weren't spending more per purchase, they were just visiting the site more often. Drove an awful lot of repeat usage, nearly 100% more repeat usage of the site. And so once they found that and they tested it with real users, they ignored the econometric analysis, which had been based on very rational drivers of behaviour, and rolled it out across the world. So those are some examples from the wider world of, I guess, the application principles. How we view some of these principles in our work. We have a process that we call cognition audits, which we use to identify nudges that can be applied in communications channels. We worked with a credit card company who were very successful at driving people to their website to apply for credit cards, but then there was a very high dropout of customers and bounce rate once they arrived on the website. They weren't actually going through to application. So we did a cognition audit of the site. We identified that one of the key problems to that point about making it easy was that when people arrived on the site, you actually had to scroll through 3 pages before you actually found the apply online button. So what we did was we moved the apply online button above the fold. So it was the first thing you saw when you landed on the site, changed the wording, changed the color of that, and it instantly increased click-throughs by 58%. Similarly, working in the banking sector, we worked with a client where they had a huge issue with their security and verification process. So people were calling up and they weren't able to access their account because they were consistently failing the security and verification questions. Which obviously was driving a very negative customer experience for them. What we identified was that one of the reasons is that when people are stressed or anxious, what tends to happen is we forget key information. You might have experienced this yourselves. If you've ever been, needed to, under conditions of stress, need to withdraw money from an ATM, for example, you get there and suddenly your PIN number's gone out of your head. And under those conditions of stress, we find it difficult to retain key information. So what we did was we reframed the wording and the language that was used around the security questions without changing the question themselves to make customers less anxious. So they felt less confrontational, frankly. So the bank wasn't saying to them, if you can't answer these questions, we can't give you access to your money. It was more along the lines of, don't worry, if you fail the security process, we've got another process we can take you through. Put people at ease, but without compromising the integrity of that security process. And that proved to be hugely effective in terms of shortening the length of calls, because people weren't having to go through multiple security processes because they were getting their questions right first time, but without compromising the security of that. And what it meant was that there was a significant increase in customer satisfaction, but also, as I say, there was an operational benefit in that the calls were much shorter because people were getting through the security process much more quickly. So those are some examples, I guess, of how some of those principles can be applied and how we apply them in customer experience and how they can also drive brand loyalty to Dave's point.
Yeah, it's amazing how things can go out of your head when you're under pressure, even if you know it off by heart. All of a sudden, it's ungraspable. And Amazon Prime, I mean, what an example of a paid loyalty program. It's really fascinating, the success of that. Okay, so final question from me. Looking ahead, what trends or developments do you both see on the horizon for the intersection of behavioural science and customer experience?
I think if we jump on, I guess, the latest trend and buzzwords and talk about generative AI, ChatGPT being the most famous example. I think what's interesting there is, chatbots have been around for a long time, and I would say that they have been improving in terms of both customer experience and effectiveness pre-ChatGPT. And typically what you see is that the AI that those types of chatbots use is focused on language understanding. So it's very much focused on trying to identify what the customer is trying to achieve, what's called their intent. So what's the mission they've got, what's the job they're trying to get done, and using natural language technology to allow the customer to express that question in their own language. And then the chatbot would recognize it. And once it recognizes what the customer is trying to achieve, it would typically then follow a relatively structured and scripted dialogue flow, a journey through that process, extracting information from the customer that it needs to look up an order, answer a piece of FAQ questions, knowledge questions, complete a transaction. So it was, if you like, possible working with teams such as Richard to use behavioral science and nudge techniques in how you scripted the answers. So you would write the answers the chatbot gives you to nudge the customer through that journey and make it a really enjoyable and simple experience. The difference now where we get into generative AI with things like ChatGPT is it's not scripted. It is generating its own responses in highly naturalistic language and giving you that answer, that information. And that is effectively almost a sort of black box algorithm. How does it generate language that sounds more human, sounds much more conversational, but also is able to cope with a much less structured interaction with the customer, so much more like a conversation with a human would be. And the interesting is then, how will these chatbots use behavioral science in how they actually talk to us? Will we be nudged in very naturalistic human conversations, as opposed to, if you like, the behavioral science being more scripted and conscious in terms of how organizations have put it in? Because we will be reliant on the providers of these technologies to generate those language models. So I think there is a great deal of potential that comes to that, but also inevitably there's always, very rightly, some concerns around the ethics and controls that sit around things that sound very human, but because we are human, we're very lazy at verification. So if what we're being told sounds plausible, then behavioral science will tell us, well, actually, we're quite likely to believe it and not seek a second and third verification. But we know that there is a lot of evidence of what they call hallucination in the responses that some of these technologies give, which it sounds plausible, but is wholly inaccurate. So I think that's an area where we will see a lot of work and adoption taking place, but also a lot of concern around data and controls and ethics going forwards. But I think it feels like an inevitability that large language models, generative AI, will become normalized in its adoption in how we interact with brands, within the relatively near future.
Yes, I'd agree 100%. And I think, that one of the challenges, as Dave mentioned, is that, we need to ensure, as generative AI becomes more widespread in its usage, we need to make sure that understanding of behavioral biases and what humans are looking for from great customer experience is baked into those tools. As with any new technology, as it becomes adopted and widespread. But as Dave says, the challenge that we now face is that it's those tools are sounding increasingly plausible, but yet the information is not accurate. If you've had any interaction with ChatGPT, you'll know that it's very easy to get it to say things that are frankly untrue, but in a very convincing way. So, one of the things about these kind of tools is that, they are still being used, or the reason for creating them and for brands to use them is for the benefit of people. Until we reach the singularity, and depending on who you believe that, that might be very soon, then we are creating these tools for the benefits of humans. We, as people listening to this broadcast, are people. We're not being replaced by robots or aliens yet. And so the efficacy of these tools is only as extensive as the benefit that they provide to humans. And as we've discussed in these episodes, as humans, we are non-rational. So to Dave's point, if we are uncertain whether we are talking to a bot or a human, that isn't a bad experience for a human, because we do not like uncertainty, and we feel deceived if we subsequently find out that we've been talking to a bot and we thought we were talking to a human, or vice versa. So So that uncertainty and understanding of those drivers of human behaviour remains important, but needs to be baked into the design of these tools. And as Dave says, the difference with generative AI is that it is creating things that and delivering experiences to consumers that will influence our behaviour in a convincing way, but unless we have the right inputs, unless we have the right frameworks around it, around the ethical use of these techniques to influence behaviour, then it could lead to some very negative outcomes. And and the other aspect is, as humans, as customers, what we often want from a lot of experiences is from a lot of customer experiences some empathy and some creativity, in particular in terms of problem solving. And the fact is, these AI tools are, in behavioural science terms, they are very system 2. They're very logical, they're very rational, because they are based on algorithms, they're based on rules. The difference between a human and an algorithm is you feed the same data into an algorithm twice, you'll get the same answer. That's not true of humans. So, when there are circumstances, particularly if we're seeking to make a complaint or get some kind of resolution to a customer query where things have gone awry, where we want someone to recognise that, to be empathetic. And robots don't have the ability to do that because they're not human. So there's still going to be limits in the use cases in which these kind of new tools and technologies can be applied, where a human still needs to be driving the interaction. And a key part of that is accountability as well. If I were in an accident tomorrow in my car with a self-driving car, I'd want someone to take responsibility for that. My insurance company would want someone to take responsibility for that. And it's not clear at the moment how that would work. And in the same way, if you are given a bad experience by a generative AI in your interaction with a brand, you would want someone to rectify that and to take responsibility for it. Our innate need for justice as humans requires it. So, those are challenges that are behavioural, that are uniquely human. And so, where the intersection of behavioural science and customer experience will go in the future, I think is around resolving some of these issues. And today's point, making sure that our understanding of the drivers of human behaviour is a key input into the design of these tools, not only to ensure they deliver a better experience, but for ethical reasons as well.
Great, thank you, Richard. It's a fascinating topic and one that's very topical right now. I know almost everyone is talking about ChatGPT. So yeah, very, very helpful and to better understand how it could be used to better influence current working practices. So I think that brings us to the end of this second podcast that we've recorded with Gobeyond Partners. So thanks again to both Dave and Richard, and we hope you enjoyed the podcast.
Thanks, Nicki. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicki.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, and why not leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google and the other podcast platforms. For more information about the Chamber, please visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.